Welcome back, everybody, to A Foggy Day on Olympus, a place for grown-up discussions aimed at grown-up people, where we consider issues of history, religion, and culture, and why they matter. My name's Mike Pierce.
And my name is Coel Campo, and I'm excited to introduce our new series.
Excited? Excited? Have you learned nothing from our podcasts up until now?
Oh, we are just horrible.
I like to think so.
Well, never mind him, everyone. The rest of us are looking at 20th century writers that are too little read in the Anglosphere.
Too little read, even though they're available in translation.
Exactly. And we're starting off with The Bridge on the Drina, which is a book that was forced upon us back in Houghton for our EMW honors course that we took. And then subsequently, as a reward, we got to travel around the Balkans for May term for 3 weeks. Unfortunately, we had to drag Mike along here with us, but it was helpful because at least he knew where we were going. So
And somebody needed to, forced upon you, you poor oppressed dad. It was consistently everyone's favourite reading every single year. More than all my history and theology lectures.
Well, this is true, and you wonder why. What was the common factor here?
We will pass over the common factor in silence.
Yes.
Okay, so the novel gives the history of Bosnia through stories about a little town, the centre of whose life and of the stories is the bridge.
Right.
And we have it here. So the town of Visegrad stands on the river Drina, and the famous bridge was erected in 1571 to 77 on the orders of Ottoman Grand Vizier Mehmed Pasha Sokolovic, who was from the area. Now, I don't know about you, but the impression I'd had from the book was that the bridge was a little steeper than this one.
Right.
Because the rise is very gentle towards the middle, and also that there was plenty of town on either side, whereas in fact, now at least, I don't know, in centuries past, now the town is virtually all on just one side of the river, isn't it?
Right.
Did that surprise you in any way?
Yeah.
Or did you get the same impression as me from the book?
I think it did. I think, especially in the book, the bridge, I think, kind of stands larger than life. And then when you get there, although the bridge is beautiful and it's impressive, there's also just not really much else going on.
Right. Well, there's a horrible reason for that we'll get to in a moment, actually.
Right.
Not quite unique to Visegrad, but all too common in Bosnia and at least one or two places in Croatia. But yeah. Okay, so here we have some pictures from the town. So the bridge survived more or less intact until 2016, when it was visited by a certain Kay Sedio, she then was, along with a bunch of other monsters, pictured here on the bridge with her literature prof, Stephen Woolsey.
Yes, and as you always said, Dr. Woolsey was the professor that all of us loved, and unfortunately, you were the professor that all of us needed.
Right. Yes. Something like that.
Yes.
Okay, moving swiftly on. For the geographically challenged, here's a map showing us where Bosnia is. It's a country, the adjective independent isn't quite appropriate, in southeastern Europe.
Right. And for those of our viewers who have never been there, which will be the majority, I guess, do you want to remind us why the adjective independent is questionable?
Well, yes, because since the Bosnian War of 1992 to 5, It's been only quasi self-governing. Frankly, it's a total mess and far too complicated to talk about here. We will cover this on some other occasion. But the fighting was only stopped by interventions from the outside world and leaning on people rather hard. And above all of the locally elected authorities is somebody with the incredibly pompous sounding title of the High Representative, appointed by maybe it's the United Nations, somebody like that, who can basically override the lot of them. And that's becoming extremely pertinent as we record this. But again, we're not going to go into that now. So it's not quite self governing because the population can't quite be trusted to govern itself without immediately descending back into violence. So, yes.
Right.
Well, here's another map showing us where Visegrad is. It's tucked up near Bosnia's eastern border with Serbia.
Right. Visegrad being where the bridge is.
Yes.
And the two shades of gray on this map kind of illustrate the country's sort of strange state that it's in.
Yes. The fighting finished with the areas in dark grey being the Republika Srpska. So the Serb Republic, which is not the same as Serbia, although a lot of the people there would like to be,
Right.
and the other half called the Federation, which consists of Muslims and a significant minority of Catholics who, in the mad logic of this part of the Balkans, therefore count as Croats. Yeah, and they're kind of just about held together.
Right, and it's like 49% one and 51% of the other, right? So it's really just like neck
Yeah.
and neck here.
Well, yes, actually, the Serb militias and the JNA, the Yugoslav National Army, held a lot more than 50% until right before the end of the war in 95, and then they were pushed back. And I think as soon as they could safely be said to hold less than half the country, peace could be made.
Right.
We're not going to go there now. It's a mad, mad, mad situation. Right. But at least we can see where Visegrad is, which is the main point for our purposes here today.
Yes.
And here's our man, Ivo Andrić. You've got his dates here, 1892 to 1975. And he called Visegrad my real home because although not born there, he was brought up there by an aunt and uncle from the age of 2. We'll get a bit more into his biography in a moment.
Right, so he was actually born in Travnik, which is about 130 miles northwest of there.
Yeah, that's about 3.25 hours drive away, even today on Bosnian roads. His dad died when Ivo was 2, and his mother took a job in Sarajevo, so she passed the young lad on to her sister-in-law and husband, who took very good care of him. But I wonder whether that's quite the point.
Right, but there was something else unusual about him in Visegrad because he was Catholic, so like you said, therefore labeled a Croat, in a place where almost everyone was either Orthodox Serb or Muslim or Jewish.
Right. And I looked up the statistics of the population in relatively recent decades, and I think there's about 30 Croats there out of the town's total population. So, yeah, basically almost none. The town has been subject to a whole load of terrible, terrible things since the time period when his novel ends in World War One. So, in World War Two, the Ustaša, the Croatian fascist government, which included Bosnia and its domains, sent troops there and they massacred a load of Serbs. And a little while later, a load of Chetniks, Serb nationalists, came, massacred a load of Muslims. And then again in the 1990s, there was a major massacre of Muslims and many more fled. Before the Bosnian War, the town was more than 60% Muslim, and today it's under 10%. Now, that's the reason that there's not a lot there. When you went there, it seemed really quiet.
Right.
Right? It always seems quiet in Visegrad for the same kind of reason that it always seems like when you get to Vukovar in eastern Croatia, you went on a quiet day because the population has just collapsed. So the town is physically bigger
Right.
than you would expect for the existing population. So it's terrible, terrible stuff. Yeah.
But Ivo Andrić would have lived before all of that, and he would have grown up looking at this bridge. And then he writes these sort of fictional stories about how it gets there, but it's pretty historically
Right.
accurate, right?
Right. I mean, a number of the stories are simply novelized accounts of real events,
Right.
in town folklore. Yes. Well, he's actually writing it during World War II, but we will come to that in a moment. Obviously, he didn't live long enough for the new disasters of the 1990s, but he just takes his story up to World War I. Yeah.
Right.
Well, he was fairly prolific, and a fair few of Andrić's works are available in translation.
Yeah, we might have guessed that you had a whole load of his works. And besides, you like to keep showing off that Ukrainian table runner in the corner there.
Yeah, yeah.
But Bosnian Chronicle, one of those books there, also goes by a different title.
Yes, for people who are hunting around for his stuff online, you should know that Bosnian Chronicle and Days of the Consuls are the same book, dealing with Travnik, his birth town, during the Napoleonic era, actually. Yeah. The people hunting around for biographies of Andrić, as I have, the only one that you're going to be able to find, in English at least, is by Celia Hawkesworth, and it was written back in the 1970s. She was a really well-known translator of local works into English and wrote language learning books as well. But it's 50 years old, and you're not going to get anything much under about $100, I think, for probably some rather tattered old book by now. So I haven't gone there, but it would be interesting if anybody's got one, doesn't need it, would like to send it to me. I'd be very grateful. Or maybe somebody will write a fresh biography someday. Anyway, one of those books that is in English that I would particularly recommend is this Signs by the Roadside. It's not a novel, nor is it non-fiction. It's a collection of single paragraphs, sentences, half pages, quotable quotes from Andrić's life. And there's a whole load of wisdom and perceptive observation in there. He's an extremely quotable sort of a person. Well, let's just give a quick overview of his life here. So we've already given you his birth and death dates. So born in Travnik in Bosnia, following the death of his father when he was just 2, he's brought up by an aunt and uncle in Visegrad, which is the town, the home of the bridge on the Drina. As a student, he joined nationalist organizations in the years before World War I, and so he was arrested and kept under house arrest for 3 years, from 1914 to 17.
Now, they actually thought he was involved in the plot to assassinate Franz Ferdinand.
Right, but they couldn't find any evidence. So he was held for a long time and then released in the summer of 1917. But yeah, he was involved in several organizations, including Young Bosnia, people who were behind the assassination. So maybe he was involved, I don't know, but certainly they couldn't prove it. Well, he studied South Slav history and literature in Zagreb after the war in 1919, and then went on to Graz in Austria, where he earned his PhD in 1924.
Yeah, and his PhD thesis was about the development of spiritual life in Bosnia under the influence of Turkish rule. And basically, he thought there wasn't any.
Right. He thought that Ottoman rule had been one 4 centuries or 4.5 centuries long disaster for Bosnia and had retarded its development. And we'll see some of that with some of the quotations we're going to give from the book in a few minutes. So he was a Yugoslav diplomat between the wars and was actually ambassador to Germany from 1939 to 41.
So that would have been in Nazi Germany. And in 1941, the Nazis invaded his country. And so he was lucky to stay out of prison, or worse, wasn't he?
Yes, he went smartly back to Belgrade. I'm not really quite sure how he managed that, but he did. And he stayed in seclusion, remaining extremely inconspicuous for the rest of the war. I think he barely went outdoors. But that was the period during which he wrote Bridge on the Drina and Days of the Consuls, or Bosnian Chronicle, so on, and they were published immediately after the war. His novels appeared at that point.
So what you're saying is, if we want to produce some more writings out of you, we ought to just put you under house arrest?
Oh, just too good to me, really.
Well, I'm just saying it might work.
I know. You're only considering my good as ever.
Public.
There's some people whose concern for one is more tyrannous than if they simply left you alone.
It's a fine line.
Yes, yeah, very fine. And you've crossed it. Right. Yeah, okay. So what we're saying, his major novels then appear after the war.
And after the war, the government was communist, so they still let him
Right.
publish. Does that mean he was pro-communist?
No, he wasn't, but he wasn't noticeably anti. He was a bit nervous for a while because he had served in a senior position in Royal Yugoslavia, right? So he thought that maybe the communists would be prepared to wallop him, but he was perhaps too useful to them culturally. And so he was actually fine. He also did take a fairly secular viewpoint in his novels. You know, he wasn't noticeably devout. And his nationalism had always been South Slav nationalism rather than, pro-Croat or pro-Serb or something like that.
Right.
Maybe we should also make the point here that although he is a Croat and Catholic, at least nominally, he tended to take a Serb point of view on things, mainly because, well, there was hardly any Croatian community in Visegrad where he'd been brought up, and he wrote in the Serb form of the language. So he's widely celebrated in Serbia today, and just a little in Croatia, yes.
Right.
And finally, then, he gets married in 1958, aged 66, so it's leaving it extremely late. His wife was about 17 years younger than him and already widowed, so they didn't have any children. And she died just 10 years later, by which time he was already edging towards ill health himself. So, yeah, he doesn't have children or grandchildren or anything. Okay, concerning the novel itself, then, The Bridge on the Drina. So it tells the story of Visegrad, or more exactly, stories of Visegrad. Not continuous history, then, but through a string of cameos, many of which are connected, though not all of them. From the 15th century, which was when the Ottomans took over Bosnia, through to World War One. And all the stories are centered around the bridge, which is the focus of the town's life. And as we've said, it was written during World War II when Andrić was living very inconspicuously in Belgrade.
So he received the Nobel Prize while he was still living.
Yes, he did, and still living with his wife, yes. Maybe time for a little story here, because some years ago we were with one of the groups, I think it was after yours, in Sarajevo, and we were attending a church, and there was a visiting preacher from England, and I think it was his fourth trip there or something like that. And after the service, my colleague, your friend, Stephen Woolsey, had a conversation with him and reported it back to me afterwards, and he was absolutely outraged Now, Stephen is the most mild-mannered person that I know.
Well, aren't we all compared to you?
Yes, thank you very much. And what the guy had said in response to Stephen saying that he talked about literature from the region to the students who are with us today was, is there any real literature from this part of the world? Stephen felt like braining him. This guy, he was coming to see his friends and do stuff in Bosnia, but still in his mind he was coming amongst savages from whom no good thing had ever come. He couldn't conceive that these people really did have a thriving historic culture, or rather cultures of their own. Absolutely unbelievable. Yeah. Anyway, so the bridge on the Drina is a pretty prominent case in point.
Right. Right. And if any of you were thinking that before you listen to this episode, now you'll know better.
Yes, you know better now. There we are. This is why you listen to this, to get educated. Right.
Right.
Well, I hunted around online to try and find some image that might depict the opening scene of the book, but alas, nothing. This is as close as I could get, and it's as AI-ish as you could wish, and I'm sorry about that. The opening scene of the book depicts the carrying out of the devshirme, and this was a tax levied by the Ottomans on their non-Muslim subjects, and it was paid not in money but in young boys who were taken away from their families forcibly to be Islamized, brought up as Muslims, and to serve as janissaries, who were the Ottomans' crack troops for many decades.
Right.
And so the opening scene is of local women beating their breasts in anguish and crying and sobbing as their sons are ripped away from them to be taken to Constantinople to serve as janissaries. It's not the only distressing scene in the early part of the book. There's one that's even worse. Fortunately, it's only a page or so, and you think, oh, what is waiting for me in this book? And there's nothing like that again, thank goodness. But there is a description of an impaling of some unfortunate. How did you react to that when you, tender-hearted young soul, that you were,
Maybe back
read this? Yeah, maybe back then, yeah.
then.
I doubt it.
Yeah, I think yeah, so you've got the Ottoman soldiers impaling this guy who is trying to impede the progress of the bridge building, and it really is enough to make you sick. I mean, unfortunately, this is the most memorable part of the book, and I feel like Andrić really toes the line of making the details just gross enough that you can't like look away, but you really want to because it's so bad. And you're kind of, you get the little tingly feeling while you're reading it. It's just,
Yeah,
it's so
yeah.
awful. But I think he makes his point early on. The reader is ill disposed to the Ottomans firmly, and you're on the side of the villagers who are sort of fighting progress throughout the book. And so, even as moderners, I feel like we wouldn't naturally agree with the villagers and think them as kind of these backwards people. But because of this scene, particularly, you've really got to just hate the Ottomans for the rest of the book.
And he does, doesn't he? He's often accused of anti-Muslim bias
Right.
in his book. But actually, concerning this story, I read something just a few days ago that explains how Andrić is accused of stealing this story wholesale from a magazine published in Sarajevo in 1915. He simply took it and lifted it and inserted that into his book.
Oh, wow.
Yes. Whoa.
Well, I
You
guess
know,
it made the point either way.
yeah. A point is an unfortunate word to use in this context, but we'll move swiftly on. Woo!
Yeah, let's do that.
Right, let's do it quickly. Okay, so here we have a picture then of Pasha. So that's his Turkicized name, often called Mehmed Pasha Sokolovic. Sokolovic will have been his local name, right? And he was raised through the Devshirme. He was born to a Bosnian Orthodox family, so in local parlance, then say Serbs, in a village near Visegrad, not in the town, forcibly recruited to become a janissary, and he rose through the ranks to become Grand Vizier.
Now, the Grand Vizier was the guy who actually ran day-to-day government of the Ottoman Empire. The Sultan, of course, was the guy that reigned, but he appointed a Grand Vizier to do all the work, basically.
Yes, yes. So you were, on the one hand, immensely privileged, but you knew that if you made any rather large false steps, it might be your last. Right. But he used his position to commission a lot of buildings in various parts of the empire, but particularly in his native Bosnia, a lot of bridges. The transport infrastructure of Bosnia is notoriously bad. And so it's through him that the bridge on the Drina is built.
Right.
Yes.
Right. So, like we mentioned before, this is a real guy, and those are the real events of how the bridge came to be there.
Right. And so here we've got a picture of it in the distance. That one's deliberately taken from the distance there, so you can see the bridge, but in the context of the town as it is now, overwhelmingly on one side of the river. It's a beautiful, beautiful river valley. The drive there from Sarajevo, we went in the bus, it was just absolutely gorgeous. Less gorgeous is three of our monsters here from, I don't think it was your year. Was that from your year? No, a later year, I think.
Yeah.
Yes, yes. So sitting on the bridge. Now, the stories run then through the 16th, 17th centuries and the 18th and on to the early 19th. But the later part of the book deals with the painful transition of Bosnia. Here is Bosnia in dark green in 1848. It's still part of the Ottoman Empire at that point. So to the right in grey, we have Serbia. Serbia was still nominally part of the empire.
But it's de facto self-governing.
Yes, there had been two uprisings there in the early 19th century, the upshot of which was to allow Serbia to govern itself. And Montenegrins will proudly tell you that they were never conquered by the Ottomans, which is kind of sort of true, but it was A, so small, and B, so poor and utterly lawless that the Ottomans just felt that properly trying to control it was, well, the game wasn't worth the candle. So, yeah, as you can see from the map, even smaller then than it is now. So it would actually grow several times during the course of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. To the north and northwest there, unfortunately, this map is far more complicated than we want to be doing with. All of the areas in darker grey, light grey, and dark red are part of the Austrian Empire, and we're not going to enter into the matter of their administrative divisions here. That's for another time.
I keep saying that.
Yeah, well, yeah, we are going to deal with a lot more Balkan history at some point, but here we're just kind of skirting around it a little, yes.
Right.
Okay, here we've got another map showing the situation from 1878 to 1914.
Right. And in 1878, amidst a major war, the Austrians took over the administration of Bosnia.
Yes, partly to keep order internally, it was becoming very violent, and no state likes chaos immediately over their borders, but also partly to prevent Serbia or the Russians from grabbing it. This is part of a long, slow slide towards World War I. So after 1878, for 30 years, it remained formally part of the Ottoman Empire and merely administered by Austria-Hungary, just as Serbia, until 1878, had been formally part of the empire but de facto self-governing. In 1878, it becomes formally independent. And then in 1908, Bosnia was formally annexed by the Austrians. So an end to all the fictions now, it's ours.
Right.
And that triggered a major crisis, huge demonstrations in Belgrade and so on, that nearly started World War One early. Okay, so now we've got a number of excerpts from the book, particularly from this later period. So, and this one concerns Ali Hodja, who is one of the more important characters in the book, and he shares distaste for the newcomers, the Austrians. To those who boasted of the speed with which they could now finish their business and reckoned how much time, money, and effort they had saved, he replied ill-humouredly that it was not important how much time a man saved, but what he did with it when he saved it. If he used it for evil purposes, then it had been better he had never had it.
That's a fair point.
Yeah.
So the Habsburgs bring in Western style efficiencies, and the locals just didn't really like it.
Right. Andrić always expresses these discontents through the minds or thoughts of Muslims, never of local Serbs. He is often accused of having a strong anti-Muslim bias, as we saw with his PhD.
Yes, he always refers to them as Turks, even though they were overwhelmingly Islamicized local Slavs.
Right. They were using the same language. They come from the same ethnic stock as the, quote, Serbs, the Orthodox, except that they, or more frequently their ancestors, had adopted Islam at some point. But using the epithet Turks was taken as a standard derogatory term. And even I've heard it used a long time ago, and just the once, but I've heard it said, yes.
Well, I mean, you are old enough.
Yes.
Yeah, so this is an interesting point because I think if you've only ever lived in the West, you might think that racism is really just an us problem, something that we can't get over, but we really ought to. But then you get out into the wider world and you find out racism exists everywhere, and the West really isn't as bad as you thought in the first place.
Right. I'm afraid that racism is the default mental mechanism of human beings. I don't have a lot of patience for the sort of starry-eyed people who say, "Oh, people have to be taught to hate; they're naturally good." No, 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 no. They're naturally predisposed to divide people up into us slash not us, and not us will particularly apply to people who don't look like us, or there's some cultural distinctive, they behave completely differently, and so on. And people need to be taught not to be like that. Right.
Right.
So, yeah, you do find plenty of racism in this part of the world, mostly not, ironically, directed towards people who are visibly of a different skin tone. You will get that in North Africa against black Africans, right? Here you won't generally say against visiting black people. So if you're a black American or a black Brit or something like that, don't worry about coming here. You're not going to be given a bad time.
Right.
But the racism is directed at the neighbors. Right? So if you're a Serb, it's directed against the Albanians. If you're an Albanian, it's directed against the Serbs. Or it can be directed against the Greeks, or the Greeks against the Slavs, and on and on and on we go.
Right.
That is most definitely still there. and it tends to be just the enlightened few who've managed to get past that.
Yeah, but again, to the modern Westerner, that sounds terrible. Well, why can't they just get along? But once you start looking at the actual history, you really understand why they feel the way that they do.
Yes, yes, although it has been exacerbated by modern circumstances.
Right.
People lived together fairly harmoniously, sometimes living rather separate lives through a lot of history, particularly in multi ethnic empires. But it was the coming of modern nationalism and modern ways of life that turned that into the witch's brew that we've seen in the late 19th century, but even more in the 20th century. And we're still not really free of it even now.
Right.
Yes. So, here again from the novel, they, the local people, he's thinking here particularly of the Muslims, they were ill at ease about the new ideas, the very nature of which was contrary to their ideas and habits. For each of them considered this interference by the authorities in his personal affairs and his family life as an unnecessary and incomprehensible humiliation.
Right. And here we're back with why the rest hates the West.
Right, yes. The rise of modern government wanting to control things, build infrastructure, tax people more efficiently, and all the rest of it meets resistance from pre modern people. The Austro Hungarian Empire may have looked pretty ramshackle and inefficient if you're comparing it with a Britain or a France or an America. But it was nevertheless a tolerably efficient modern Western state. And it was sweeping aside the Ottoman Empire in this area, where things had been conducted very, very differently for centuries. And yes, it was experienced by ordinary people as a humiliation, because before I could get on and run my own life and do things my own way. And now here's some official from a place far away, or perhaps someone who I think is socially junior to me, insisting that I tell them or pay them or measure or give an account for myself, etc., etc. All of that.
Right.
Yes. So, yeah, that was very much disliked.
Yeah, and I think we again in the modern West we would see that as so quaint, and say, well, efficiency means progress and things are going to be better because of all of this government. And it's easy to think that here in the West, but I think the problem is it's hard to count the cost of what we may have lost along the way to our progress myth, basically.
Yes, I always feel very, very torn about this because, on the one hand, in the pursuit of technical progress and greater prosperity, we have undoubtedly made ourselves high tech barbarians. And that is absolutely and immediately obvious to non Westerners looking at us today. But on the other hand, there's absolutely no idealizing of the pre modern state. I mean, this was rammed home to me again just a few weeks ago when I was up actually in Kumrovec, which is Tito's birth town, and they had put together there a kind of ethno village of houses and shops and a smithy and all the rest of it, as they would have been in the late 19th, early 20th centuries. And as I said to one or two of the people who were there with me at the time, you and I wouldn't want to go back and live like that. It would have been smelly and unhygienic and cold and damp and uncomfortable and occasionally even hungry. Usually not, but we wouldn't want it.
Right.
But nevertheless, it gives you a certain kind of security. And if that's what you're used to, the sort of modern comforts are not going to come your way immediately. What is going to come your way immediately is some government official with his finger in your face and insisting you do X, Y, and Z. And that's not going to go down well. Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Well, Again, another quotation of the same sort from this phase of the novel. Perhaps this impure infidel faith that puts everything in order, cleans everything up, repairs and embellishes everything, only in order suddenly and violently to demolish and destroy, might spread through the whole world. It might make of all God's world an empty field for its senseless building and criminal destruction, a pasturage for its insatiable hunger and incomprehensible demands.
So basically, saying the Western pursuit of progress can't be satisfied, and it'll go on continuing to mess things up even when we think we've got them the right way around.
And indeed it has. Look at the Shard in London. Look at the ghastly plate glass monstrosities going up everywhere, facing traditional identities and local identities to turn the earth into what Roger Scruton called a ubiquitous nowhere. Right? That might be acceptable in the case of a modern airport, but when it comes to the actual communities that we seek to live in, it's not acceptable at all.
Right.
Right? And it's part of the reason why modern people feel so lonely and rootless, and it gives an air of meaninglessness to our lives. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, and staying with these. So here's the army. The army, too, was working on its own account even more rapidly and inconsiderately than the civil authorities. They put up barracks, cleared wasteland, planted and changed the appearance of whole hills. All the townsmen saw this unhealthy activity as a bad omen. Had it been left to them, the town would have gone on looking as any other little Oriental town. No one would needlessly create work, or make plans, or interfere, or change the aspect which God had given to the town. Well, he's making the same kind of points here as he is in Bosnian Chronicle / Days of the Consuls in Travnik about 100 years before. There, one of the main issues was the plan of the Napoleonic diplomatic representatives, because Travnik was still part of the Ottoman Empire, to build a modern road connecting the town to the outside world. And the locals didn't want it. They they didn't want to be connected to the outside world. They didn't want it to be easier for government and its officials to come and stick their noses in everything, or for outsiders suddenly to appear. They liked things the way they were. And this reminds me of an amazing book that I read about a decade ago or more now, called The Discovery of France by Graham Robb. And it is, on the face of it, on an almost impossibly nerdy topic, but it's not nerdy at all. It is about the extreme difficulty that French governments had over 2 centuries, a bit more than 2 centuries, to create modern maps of France. And they would send out map makers into the countryside to try and measure things and see who owned what land and what the size of plots were and all this kind of thing. And these people were often attacked, some of them even killed, by irate locals, because they could see that this was the extension of the hand of government in their lives to tax them more efficiently, to take away their sons to serve in the army because they knew exactly who was who and where they were and all the rest of it. So the resistance of ordinary people. In the process, he points out that loads of people didn't see themselves as French in our sense at all. For them, France was the area immediately around Paris, right? They saw themselves as belonging to whatever province, whether Gascons or what have you, from different parts of France, Normans or something like that. Absolutely amazing book. I would say one of the best history books I've read on any topic, because it takes you right into how pre-modern people think and how they react against the forces of modernization that are thrust upon them. Superb. Okay, end of book review.
Yeah, you got all that off your chest. You feel better now.
Yes, a little.
Now, Ivo Andrić, remember him? Can we get back to that?
Oh, yes. Okay, right. Let's get back to that. Okay. Well, final quotation then. In Visegrad in 1885, money, quote, like fresh blood, began to circulate in hitherto unknown quantities. Here we've got an illustration of a late 19th century Habsburg coin and banknote, 1,000 gulden. In that exciting circulation of gold, silver, and negotiable paper, every man could warm his hands, or at least gladden his eyes, for it created, even for the poorest of men, the illusion that his own bad luck was only temporary, and therefore the more bearable.
So, Andrić is just reminding us that in the pre modern economy, people didn't use money very much.
No, they didn't. They used it relatively little. People produced an awful lot of the things that they needed to consume or to use themselves. They built their own houses. Many of them made their own clothes. If they had small plots of land, produced a lot of their own food, and so on. And where they didn't, often they would simply exchange stuff. So there was a barter system. So the amount that they actually needed money for was very limited. This is one of the reasons, by the way, why it's kind of difficult for us to measure changes in living standards over periods of time in pre-modern economies, because you can't really put a monetary value on all of that stuff. But this was coming into existence now that the Austrians were here, because we're now entering this commercial economy. And one of the advantages, as he's pointing out here, is that, well, if you are poor, maybe you could get some more of this money stuff and you would end up rich. Whereas absent money, if you're born poor, as most people are or were, well, you're never really going to change your situation.
So, like we said before, it's kind of this dualistic nature of progress. On the one hand, it's really going to cause some issues for them. But on the other, maybe some good might come out of it.
Right, yes, but only in the longest of terms. And what happens in the shortest term is the disadvantages, hence all of the resistance. And we see that still today. I mean, that's at least part of what has fueled radical Islam in the late 20th, early 21st centuries, even though the steam seems to have gone out of that movement now to a significant extent. Yeah. Okay, and to finish then, here is a crowd of barbarians around Ivo Andric's statue in Belgrade. And his apartment, which is now a museum to his life, is just 50 yards away. I scratched and scratched around for decent photos of that and couldn't find it. It's fairly central in Belgrade, well worth going to. And you remember when we went in there? It's only one floor up from ground level, and we went up the staircase. I think it's one floor up, maybe it's two. But in the center of the building was a cage lift. So,
Yeah. And it worked, I think, too, right?
oh yes, let's hope so. That's all they'd got.
Right.
There's quite a lot of buildings from the early 20th century or even late 19th in Belgrade that have got those kind of cage lifts. There's not too many still operating in America these days, but in Belgrade they're fairly frequent. Now, we didn't have to use it there. One time we went to a museum dedicated to the paintings of Pai Jovanovic, and that was way up on the fifth floor of one of those kind of buildings. And so up in the creaking cage we went. That was fun. Yeah.
So, this is interesting, his museum, because he's a Catholic Croat from Bosnia, but he's being celebrated in the capital of Serbia. So, he's a true Yugoslav then.
Yeah, I think you could say that he is. And certainly, Yugo nostalgics, as we call them in this part of the world, would all be very happy with the memory of Andrić. So generally with Serbs, because he basically converts himself into a kind of Serb, I suppose, in his overall outlook. In support of Yugoslavia, he's viewed not very favourably by Bosnian Muslims because the opinions he expressed about them were not very favourable. And Croats, though they will sometimes claim him, often consider him to be a bit distant to themselves and not writing in the Croatian form of the language for the most part. Yeah.
Right. Now, next week, we'll be looking at a novel that's so famous, it's actually lately been turned into a series on Netflix.
Right. Have you got to watch it, by the way, or not yet?
No, but I think I'd probably better.
Right. Yes, it's Giuseppe de Lampedusa's The Leopard, Il Gattopardo, which is ranked in Italian public opinion as second only to Dante as their country's greatest work of literature.
Right.
So, yeah, that's what we're doing next week. So, episode number 2 in this series of 4.
Yes, and another book you've probably never heard of, so you should probably tune in.
Yep, that's the theme, right? These are works too little read in the Anglosphere. Yeah.
Yes.
So we hope you've enjoyed this, and we'll look forward to seeing you next week.
Yes, and we're trying to annoy the whole world with these broadcasts. So please, if you would do us a favor and repost our videos to any kind of social media that you paddle around in.
Yeah, that would be good. And we'll look forward to seeing you again next week. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye, everyone.